ora! Welcome to Campfire Stories. I'm Rose from Christchurch City Libraries, and I'm reading Agatha Christie's The Moving Finger. We've been introduced to quite a few people who may or may not be the poison pen murderer. Do you think you might know who it is? Let's see if we've got any more clues coming up in this episode. As Jerry stood staring after Mr. Pye, the church door opened and the Reverend Caleb Dane Calthrop came out. He smiled vaguely at me. Good morning, Mr. I helped him. Burton. Of course. You mustn't think I don't remember you. Your name had just slipped my memory for the moment. A beautiful day. Yes, I said rather shortly. He peered at me. But something... yes, that poor unfortunate child who was in service at the Symingtons. I find it hard to believe, I must confess, that we have a murderer in our midst, Mr. Burton. It does seem a bit fantastic, I said. Something else has reached my ears. He leaned towards me. I learn that there have been anonymous letters going about. Have you heard any rumour of such things? I have heard, I said. Cowardly and dastardly things. He paused and quoted an enormous stream of Latin. Those words of Horace are very applicable, don't you think? He said. Absolutely, I said. There didn't seem anyone more I could profitably talk to, so I went home, dropping in for some tobacco and for a bottle of sherry, so as to get some of the humbler opinions of the crime. A nasty tramp, seemed to be the verdict. Come to the door they do, and whine and ask for money, and then if it's a girl alone in the house they turn nasty. My sister Dora, over at a comacre, she had a nasty experience one day. Drunk he was, and selling those little printed poems. The story went on, ending with the intrepid Dora courageously banging the door in the man's face and taking refuge and barricading herself in some vague retreat, which I gathered from the delicacy in mentioning it must be the lavatory. And there she stayed till her lady came home. I reached Little Furze just a few minutes before lunchtime. Joanna was standing in the drawing-room window, doing nothing at all, and looking as though her thoughts were miles away. "What have you been doing with yourself?" I asked. "Oh, I don't know. Nothing particular." I went out onto the veranda. 2 chairs were drawn up to an iron table, and there were 2 empty sherry glasses. On another chair was an object at which I looked with bewilderment for some time. "What on earth is this?" "Oh," said Joanna, "I think it's a photograph of a diseased spleen or something. Dr. Griffith seemed to think I'd be interested to see it." I looked at the photograph with some interest. Every man has his own way of courting the female sex. I should not myself choose to do it with photographs of spleens, diseased or otherwise. Still, no doubt Joanna had asked for it. "It looks most unpleasant," I said. Joanna said it did rather. "How is Griffith?" I asked. "He looked tired and very unhappy. I think he's got something on his mind." "A spleen that won't yield to treatment? Don't be silly. I mean something real." "I should say the man's got you on his mind. I wish you'd lay off him, Joanna." "Oh, do shut up. I haven't done anything." "Women always say that." Joanna whirled angrily out of the room. The diseased spleen was beginning to curl up in the sun. I took it by one corner and brought it into the drawing-room. I had no affection for it myself, but I presumed it was one of Griffith's treasures. I stooped down and pulled out a heavy book from the bottom shelf of the bookcase in order to press the photograph flat again between its leaves. It was a ponderous volume of somebody's sermons. The book came open in my hand in a rather surprising way. In another minute I saw why. From the middle of it, a number of pages had been neatly cut out. I stood staring at it. I looked at the title page. It had been published in 1840. There could be no doubt at all. I was looking at the book from the pages of which the anonymous letters had been put together. Who had cut them out? Well, to begin with, it could be Emily Barton herself. She was perhaps the obvious person to think of. Or it could have been Partridge. But there were other possibilities. The pages could have been cut out by anyone who had been alone in this room, any visitor, for instance, who had sat there waiting for Miss Emily, or even anyone who called on business. No, that wasn't so likely. I had noticed that when one day a clerk from the bank had come to see me, Partridge had shown him into the little study at the back of the house. That was clearly the house routine. A visitor then? Someone of good social position. Mr. Pye? Amy Griffith? Mrs. Dane Calthrop? The gong sounded and I went into lunch. Afterwards, in the drawing room, I showed Joanna my find. We discussed it from every aspect. Then I took it down to the police station. They were elated at the find, and I was patted on the back for what there was, after all, the sheerest piece of luck. Graves was not there, but Nash was, and rang up the other man. They would test the book for fingerprints, though Nash was not hopeful of finding anything. I may say that he didn't. They were mine, Partridge's, and nobody else's, merely showing that Partridge dusted conscientiously. Nash walked back with me up the hill. I asked how he was getting on. We're narrowing it down, Mr. Burton. We've eliminated the people it couldn't be. Ah, I said, and who remains? Miss Grinch. She was to meet a client at a house yesterday afternoon by appointment. The house was situated not far along the Comacre Road. That's the road that goes past the Symingtons. She would have had to pass the house both going and coming the week before, the day the anonymous letter was delivered, and Mrs. Symington's committed suicide was her last day at Symington's office. Mr. Symington thought at first she had not left the office at all that afternoon. He had Sir Henry Lushington with him all the afternoon and rang several times for Miss Grinch. I find, however, that she did leave the office between 3 and 4. She went out to get some high denomination stamp of which they had run short. The office boy could have gone, but Miss Grinch elected to go, saying she had a headache and would like the air. She wasn't gone long. But long enough? Yes, long enough to hurry along to the other end of the village, slip the letter in the box, and hurry back. I must say, however, that I cannot find anybody who saw her near the Symingtons' house. Would they notice? They might and they might not. Who else is in your bag? Nash looked very straight ahead of him. You'll understand that we can't exclude anybody at all. No, I said, I see that. He said gravely, Miss Griffith went to Brenton for a meeting of the Girl Guides yesterday. She arrived rather late. You don't think? No, I don't think, but I don't know. Miss Griffith seems an eminently sane, healthy-minded woman, but I say I don't know. What about the previous week? Could she have slipped the letter in the box? It's possible. She was shopping in the town that afternoon. He paused. The same applies to Miss Emily Barton. She was out shopping early yesterday afternoon, and she went for a walk to see some friends on the road past the Symingtons' house the week before. I shook my head unbelievingly. Finding the cut book and little furs was bound, I knew, to direct attention to the owner of that house. But when I remembered Miss Emily coming in yesterday so bright and happy and excited, damn it all, excited. Yes, excited. Pink cheeks, shining eyes. Surely not because. I said thickly, this business is bad for one. One sees things, one imagines things. Yes, it isn't very pleasant to look upon the fellow creatures one meets as possible criminal lunatics. He paused for a moment, then went on. And there's Mr. Pye. I said sharply, so you have considered him? Nash smiled. Oh yes, we've considered him all right. A very curious character. Not, I should say, a very nice character. He's got no alibi. He was in his garden alone on both occasions. So you're not only suspecting women? I don't think a man wrote the letters. In fact, I'm sure of it. And so is Graves, always accepting our Mr. Pye, that is to say, who's got an abnormally female streak in his character. But we've checked up on everybody for yesterday afternoon. That's a murder case, you see. You're all right, he grinned, and so is your sister, and Mr. Symington didn't leave his office after he got there, and Dr. Griffith was on a round in the other direction, and I've checked upon his visits. He paused, smiled again, and said, "You see, we are thorough." I said slowly, "So your case is eliminated down to those 4, Miss Grinch, Mr. Pye, Miss Griffith, and little Miss Barton? Oh, no, we've got a couple more, besides the vicar's lady." "You thought of her?" "We've thought of everybody, but Mrs. Dane Calthrop is a little too openly mad, if you know what I mean. Still, she could have done it. She was in a wood watching birds yesterday afternoon, and the birds can't speak for her." He turned sharply as Owen Griffith came into the police station. "Hello, Nash. I heard you were round asking for me this morning. Anything important?" "Inquest on Friday, if that suits you, Dr. Griffith." "Right. Moresby and I are doing the PM tonight." Nash said, "There's just one other thing, Dr. Griffith. Mrs. Symington was taking some cachets, powders or something, that you prescribed for her." He paused. Owen Griffith said, "Yes?" "Would an overdose of those cachets have been fatal?" Griffith said dryly, "Certainly not. Not unless she'd taken about 25 of them." "But you once warned her about exceeding the dose, so Miss Holland tells me." "Oh, that, yes. Mrs. Symington was the sort of woman who would go and overdo anything she was given. Fancy that to take twice as much would do her twice as much good. And you don't want anyone to overdo even aspirin, bad for the heart. And anyway, there's absolutely no doubt about the cause of death. It was cyanide." "Oh, I know that. You don't get my meaning. I only thought that when committing suicide, you prefer to take an overdose of a soporific rather than to feed yourself prussic acid." "Oh, quite. On the other hand, prussic acid is more dramatic and is certain to do the trick. With barbiturates, for instance, you can bring the victim round if only a short time had elapsed." "I see. Thank you, Dr. Griffith." Griffith departed, and I said goodbye to Nash. I went slowly up the hill home. Joanna was out, at least there was no sign of her, and there was a memorandum scribbled on the telephone block, presumably for the guidance of either Partridge or myself. "If Dr. Griffith rings up, I can't go on Tuesday, but could manage Wednesday or Thursday." I raised my eyebrows and went into the drawing room. I sat down in the most comfortable armchair. None of them were very comfortable. They tended to have straight backs and were reminiscent of the late Mrs. Barton, and stretched out my legs and tried to think the whole thing out. With sudden annoyance, I remembered that Owen's arrival had interrupted my conversation with the inspector, and that he had just mentioned 2 other people as being possibilities. I wondered who they were. Partridge, perhaps, for one. After all, the cut book had been found in this house, and Agnes could have been struck down quite unsuspecting by her guide and mentor. No, you couldn't eliminate Partridge. But who was the other? Somebody perhaps that I didn't know? Mrs. Cleet, the original local suspect? I closed my eyes. I considered 4 people, strangely unlikely people in turn. Gentle, frail little Emily Barton? What points were there actually against her? A starved life, dominated and repressed from early childhood, too many sacrifices asked of her, her curious horror of discussing anything not quite nice. Was it actually a sign of inner preoccupation with just these themes? Was I getting too horribly Freudian? I remembered a doctor once telling me that the mutterings of gentle maiden ladies when going off under an anaesthetic were a revelation. You wouldn't think they knew such words. Amy Griffith? Surely nothing repressed or inhibited about her. Cheery, mannish, successful, a full, busy life. Yet Mrs. Dane Calthrop had said, "Poor thing." And there was some remembrance. I got it. Owen Griffith saying something like, "We had an attack of anonymous letters up north where I had a practice." Had that been Amy Griffith's work too? Surely rather a coincidence. 2 outbreaks of the same thing? Stop a minute. They'd tracked down the author of those. Griffith had said so. A schoolgirl. Cold it was suddenly. Must be a draught from the window. I turned uncomfortably in my chair. Why did I suddenly feel so queer and upset? Go on thinking. Amy Griffith? Perhaps it was Amy Griffith, not that other girl. And Amy had come down here and started her tricks again. And that was why Owen Griffith was looking so unhappy and hag-ridden. He suspected. Yes, he suspected. Mr. Pye? Not somehow a very nice little man. I could imagine staging the whole business, laughing. That telephone message on the telephone pad in the hall. Why did I keep thinking of it? Griffith and Joanna. He was falling for her. No, that wasn't why the message worried me. It was something else. My senses were swimming. Sleep was very near. I repeatedly, idiotically said to myself, "No smoke without fire. No smoke without fire." That's it. It all links up together. And then I was walking down the street with Megan and Elsie Holland past. She was dressed as a bride and people were murmuring, "She's going to marry Dr. Griffith at last. Of course they've been engaged secretly for years." There we were in the church, and Dane Calthrop was reading the service in Latin. And in the middle of it, Mrs. Dane Calthrop jumped up and cried energetically, "It's got to be stopped, I tell you, it's got to be stopped." For a minute or two I didn't know whether I was asleep or awake. Then my brain cleared and I realised I was in the drawing room of Little Furs and that Mrs. Dane Calthrop had just come through the window and was standing in front of me saying with nervous violence, "It has got to be stopped, I tell you." I jumped up. I said, "I beg your pardon. I'm afraid I was asleep. What did you say?" Mrs. Dane Calthrop bet one fist fiercely on the palm of her other hand. "It's got to be stopped. These letters, murder. You can't go on having poor innocent children like Agnes Waddle killed." "You're quite right," I said, "but how do you propose to set about it?" Mrs. Dane Calthrop said, "We've got to do something." I smiled, perhaps in a rather serious, superior fashion. "And what do you suggest that we should do?" "Get the whole thing cleared up. I said this wasn't a wicked place. I was wrong. It is." I felt annoyed. I said, not too politely, "Yes, my dear women, but what are you going to do?" Mrs. Dane Calthrop said, "Put a stop to it all, of course. The police are doing their best. If Agnes could be killed yesterday, their best isn't good enough." "So you know better than they do?" "Not at all. I don't know anything at all. That's why I'm going to call in an expert." I shook my head. "You can't do that. Scotland Yard will only take over on a demand from the Chief Constable of the county. Actually, they have sent Graves." "I don't mean that kind of expert. I don't mean someone who knows about anonymous letters or even about murder. I mean someone who knows people. Don't you see? We want someone who knows a great deal about wickedness." It was a queer point of view, but it was somehow stimulating. Before I could say any more, Mrs. Dane Calthrop nodded her head at me and said in a quick, confident tone, "I'm going to see about it right away." And she went out of the window again. Well, I wonder who Mrs. Dane Calthrop is going to bring in to try and solve this. I have a feeling we're about to meet Miss Marple. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.